Wonderful. Good morning to everyone that's just joining us. Welcome. We're glad to have you here this morning with us. Please feel free to jot in the chat your name and what organization you're with so we know who's with us this morning. And we'll give it about 1 more minute and then we'll formally get started. Thank you. We see some names coming in. Kristen, Daniel, Sohana. Awesome. So glad to have you guys here with us this morning. Celia, welcome. Clara Purr, Julie, good morning. Another Julie, good morning all. Thank you all for hopping on with us this morning. We have an excellent presentation and presenter. We're just allowing time for people to hop on and get comfortable this morning in this dreary weather that we're having. See lots of different places representing here this morning. Very glad that you guys are here with us. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started this morning. I think others will hop on, but we just want to be respectful of everybody's time this morning. Good morning. My name is Andrea Perdomo Morales, and I am the co-chair of Communities Concerned for Immigrants and Refugees. This networking opportunity is brought to us by the support of the Reach Healthcare Foundation and is also guided by the work of 10 health advisors. So we are very fortunate to have this opportunity through Communities Concerned for Immigrants and Refugees to host a variety of different speakers that are able to share with us best practices and just other important information for those of us who are working with immigrants and refugees. And this morning, we are very fortunate to have with us Catherine Anderson. Before I get into her extensive just bio and all the experiences that she has, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. We are going to be recording this session. And we would love for you all to insert your questions that you have. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And if you'll notice down at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little box that says Q&A. Please enter all of your questions there. And then when we get to the end of Catherine's presentation, we will make sure to get through as many of those as possible. With this being recorded this morning, we will send this out through, if you're on our mailing list, you'll get a copy of it that way. Otherwise, you can also access it on our website, which is ccirkc.com. So through those ways, you'll be able to access all of the information, and Catherine will also make her PowerPoint available, as well as some other handouts that she has for us. So we have a wonderful morning in store for us. There are more than 70 different languages spoken in the Kansas City metropolitan schools. This indicates the number of languages that not only are spoken by students in our schools, but also by family members as they interact in the community, at medical facilities, government and social service agencies, places of worship, and more. Interpreters are critical to successful communication when we exchange information with those who are unfamiliar with the English language. Our guest speaker today will guide us in understanding strategies that lead to an effective interpreter experience for us and the people with whom we interact. Catherine Anderson is the manager of language and cultural services at Jewish Vocational Services, or otherwise known as JVS, located in Kansas City, Missouri. There, she directs the provision of skilled interpreters to agencies, schools, clinics, and hospitals in the metro area. Catherine has been instrumental in developing interpreter training, cultural competency training, and cultural competency assessments. She is an innovator and advocate of increasing professionalism within the field of interpretation and translation. Catherine is a founding commissioner with the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. I am pleased to introduce Catherine Anderson as our guest speaker today. Good morning, Catherine. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Andrea. It's so wonderful to be with you all today. And the first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge many of you who are working in interpreting, either informally or formally, who use your bilingual skills to help your community and strengthen your community and give, your best. We all appreciate that. And if you could hear an applause, you would hear it right now from many of us. What I have today is kind of a real basic hands-on overview of all the ingredients that it takes to work with interpreters effectively. So I'm going to give you a lot of information, but as Andrea told you, you'll have the PowerPoint too to refer back to as a resource. So even if I don't cover every single point that's on a slide, you can refer back to it. I think now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm always so happy when technology works, and it looks like it's working. I hope that you can see this. I'm going to start right here from the very beginning. So if there are any problems and you can't see it, somehow try to communicate that to me. But I think we're doing okay. We have the title here, How to Work Effectively with an Interpreter. And we recognize that we do have a country of diverse languages and ethnicities challenging us to work effectively. We're building what I like to call a community of trust, in which we're connected by our commitment to help each other and create a thriving community. We're always challenged by changing community needs, services, the economy, regulations, COVID, big change for all of us. At the same time, we're all human. We have limited knowledge and vision, of course, and we need each other to understand our work. And we need to talk about what we see and what we perceive. So we want to be open about our questions and any insights we have about interpreting. So we're just going to take off, and I'm going to give you some more information, and then we'll start in about interpreting in particular. Language use in the U.S. is always a fascinating topic, and it really, compels us to even work more strongly together. In 2019, we had the total foreign born of almost 45,000 people. So this is really quite a lot. 45 million. The percentage of foreign born of that number, 13.7%. Speak a language other than English, 22%. Speak English less than very well. This is the number that we pay attention to right here. And that is 46.4%. That means this particular community will really need interpreting. A couple of things to tell you. We have American Sign Language is used by 2 million people, and it's the 4th largest language spoken in the US after Spanish and Chinese. And I point that out because so much of what we know about interpreting for spoken languages, which I'm going to focus in on today, is really borrowed and exchanged and enhanced by knowledge and information we have from the sign language community. So we're deeply grateful for that, to that community. Something just to let you know, the word Wikipedia, we always use Wikipedia, I'm sure many of us do. It comes from the Hawaiian word wiki. Believe it or not, if you want to say something, to do something very fast, you would say wiki wiki. So today we can learn some Hawaiian. In Kansas City, we have, I'm speaking of the whole metro area, we've identified probably these 5 largest ethnicities and languages. People coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, new refugees who've been here, consistently for a number of years. They are primarily speakers of Swahili, Kinyarwanda, and French, other languages too, but primarily those are the main ones. We also have lots of people from Somalia. And many of them, of course, are Somali speakers, but also some of them speak Mai, which is a Bantu language, a Somali Bantu language. From Burma, also known as Myanmar, we have various languages, Burmese, Karen, and Chin languages, multiple Chin languages, as well as Karenni. We have many people from Iraq, and primarily they're Arabic speakers, but we also have some Kurdish speakers. Afghanistan as well. Of course, we are getting more and more humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan. And these are Pashto and Dari speakers, as well as Farsi speakers. Alrighty. A tool we always recommend, and if you haven't done this already, is the implicit bias tool. And it's a way to understand our own biases. There's so many cultures, so much to understand. As Andrea told us earlier, 70 different languages within our school districts. That, really is a compelling reason why we need to figure out our own biases and stereotypes. And it's a very useful tool for our guidance as we work in this field. I just want to introduce you to a very key policy, and this is really the foundation for our programs in interpreting, and it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically Title VI. And this is the law, this is the non-discrimination law, and it's quite comprehensive, but within it, there is a specific language related to language access. So I'll just read it. No person in the United States shall, on ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program, or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so this means that any program that receives any kind of federal funding, and this could be Medicaid, it could be federal funding for the schools, it could be just about anything, refugee resettlement funding, any social service program, any educational program, legal program, whatever that has federal funding has to provide equal access. And this goes back to this phrase here, national origin, which really means a person does not necessarily, probably does not speak English well enough to, access services. And so this is the law that protects people. Now the law has a little finer line to it from the year 2000, an executive order by President Clinton. And this was improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. And this clarified what federally assisted programs had to do. So you could read this too on your own. I'm just going to keep going because I know we don't have a whole lot of time and I have so much to tell you. Our next slide, where is it? Come on. We have class standards, which would be culturally and linguistically appropriate services. And these are guidelines for care that's respectful of a patient's cultural beliefs and needs and language needs. And it includes the use of interpreters. And one thing to remember, not all class standards are legally enforceable, but it does set the tone and the standard overall. So this is a very good one as well. Now let's talk specifically about what does an interpreter do. This is a very well-defined job description. And here it is. The basic purpose of the interpreter is to facilitate understanding in communication between two people who are speaking two different languages. That is the only job description an interpreter has. They will not be a co-counselor with you. They will not be a co-doctor. They haven't had time to go to medical school. They won't provide rides for the person or do extra phone calls that are unsupervised or unattended by you. And the interpreter follows a very strict code of ethics. It's a code of ethics around confidentiality. Very, very important. Interpreters who work with us at JVS, for example, and I'm sure across any agency across the city, sign a privacy statement as well, that it emphasizes confidentiality and all HIPAA requirements as well. Accuracy, which really means that the person who is interpreting is qualified in terms of language proficiency, and they know the structures and protocols of interpreting, which is never to omit, change, or add anything to the message that's being stated. we'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means when somebody is practicing. An interpreter has no opinions and no beliefs. And of course, this is really important when it comes to neutrality. Very often, interpreting sessions are emotionally loaded. They're concerning, and an interpreter is trained not to have an opinion about the situation that's taking place. They maintain boundaries. As I said, they don't offer a ride to somebody. We instruct interpreters not to be alone with the client for too long, because inevitably what happens is that that non-English speaker trusts the interpreter much more so than they would trust the staff person, because the interpreter speaks their language. And so they may presume that that interpreter knows everything. And that's just not simply the case. The staff person, has the resources and the body of knowledge. And the interpreter is facilitating communication. That's their job. And so we really encourage people to, be sure that they're maintaining those boundaries. One thing is they're never, if the staff person has to leave the room, the interpreter gets up, excuses herself or himself, and stands by the door too, that they're, making sure they're not in the room at the same time. Self-development as an interpreter. This is really important. There are new words, terms, phrases coming into our language all the time. Recently in the last year and a half with COVID, we've had to learn so much, about vaccines, about, contagion, so many elements to it. So an interpreter is constantly learning new terms in words in the language. And they also have to realize that if they have lived here in the United States for a number of years, at least 3 years, the language at home has changed. Language is constantly evolving. And so they know they need to keep up with new phrasing and, ways of stating things. Respect for everyone. Interpreting is complex and charged, and it can be frustrating. And so an interpreter learns to maintain that professional respect at all times. And of course, that's part of professionalism. And by that, we mean too, not only following the code of ethics and the interpreter protocols, but being on time, dressing business casual, not wearing sandals, for instance, in a hospital, all of those regulations. An interpreter is a trained professional. They've mastered that interpreter's code of ethics. They take classes such as our Bridging the Gap class offered through JVS. We also have beginning classes for interpreters. They prepare for certification if they're headed in that direction. We do have the Healthcare Certification Commission, but it's for healthcare. Many people want to, focus in on education interpreting or social services interpreting, and that is fine. But we do encourage them to get the training, especially through Bridging the Gap and other city training opportunities that are offered. And as we said earlier, they do prepare every day to be the best interpreter possible. Now, just to kind of clarify, many of you probably know this, but I always touch base on interpreting terms. So an interpreter is a trained bilingual speaker who delivers an oral interpretation from one language to another. So it's oral and it's spoken. A translator, however, is a trained bilingual speaker who provides a written translation from one language to another. So that is written. Now we make the distinction because not everybody has the same capacity in both of these. Many people are much better at spoken language and oral interpretation. They don't want to translate because maybe they haven't been trained in that area. We can't presume that because somebody is speaking in their language that they also feel confident in doing translation, and vice versa. A translator very often would never attempt interpretation. They would be comfortable with it, some aspect of translation. I prefer literary translation myself. I have the utmost appreciation and awe for interpreters And I know my limits. I would never do that. And so you need to kind of be careful about that. You can't presume it. If you do have a document, with your client that that comes up in your interpreting session, what you can do is read that document. And then the interpreter will speak the document, will interpret what you're stating. That kind of gets around, the uneasiness about, whether or not the person will want to be translating the document. Okay, I'm going to ask some questions, which you probably know the answer to. First one, who is the best person to use as an interpreter? A relative or friend of the family you know and who speaks your same language? In your head, you can think it if you want to put it in the chat or whatever, but we would say, oh, I have true or false there. Does that make sense? Okay. A relative or a friend of the family you know and who speaks your same language. I would say that would be false. And the reason why is that a relative or friend is somebody who really wants to protect you very often. And that person may block or filter out critical information that you would need to know. Because they may love you and they don't want you hurt. And so we often say that a relative or a friend is not the best choice to use as an interpreter. Okay, this one, your older child who speaks English perfectly and interprets for you all the time. Again, that older child would not be the best interpreter. Because there are so many things that a child would not know. Even a child who's 15 or 14 years old, a minor child, a child under 18, we would say is not the best person to interpret. You would not want that child, for instance, to have to interpret things related to issues around reproduction, that kind of thing. You don't want to put a kid in that role. And then another one here, who's the best person? Of course, the trained interpreter who has had experience. All righty, I see there are a couple of chats. I'll have to, I can't really see those, but I'm glad that there's a response. I'll take a look in a minute. As we said, the best interpreter is a bilingual staff person who's trained and competent in the skill of interpreting. A staff interpreter, somebody whose role is to be an interpreter, a contracted interpreter service. And that's because those people have been screened and have been tested and oriented and trained. So through an interpreter service. A community volunteer interpreter. I know those interpreters are valuable, and I would say to use them, definitely use them, but really be sure that they do have competency in the languages they're interpreting. Either they have a degree, or they've studied in the language, or they've lived in the language and have worked professionally. Those are really good indicators. And you could also choose to give them a language proficiency test as well. Telephone interpreter lines or video remote as well. Those are used, are done through companies too, in which people are screened and vetted. Okay. Who is not appropriate to work as an interpreter? And as we said, friends, family members, minor children, anyone who has not demonstrated proficiency in both languages, anyone who's not received training in interpretation. And we underline training and interpretation because so much of our training is focused on confidentiality, boundaries, and the different strategies for issues that come up. Interpreting is after a person has mastered their language pair, English and another language. When they master those languages, it's all ethics. And ethics takes a lot of discussion, a lot of training, and wisdom and experience as well. Anyone who does not have an understanding of ethics interpreting practices, of course, we would want that person to interpret. We have here a picture of our interpreters in training, and just to kind of show you, this is one of our Bridging the Gap classes which is the training that's known all over the country by the Cross-Cultural Healthcare Program. We've had that license for over 20 years, and it really draws interpreters from all over the community. So we have Burmese interpreters represented here, Swahili interpreters, Arabic interpreters, Spanish, Nepali, I believe Vietnamese as well. I may have left out a language. And then we have our instructor, Mr. Guerrero, who's been with us, oh my goodness, well over a decade, probably maybe 15 years at least, as our instructor in interpreting. So I want to kind of introduce you to what we call our interpreting protocols so that you know what the interpreter learns. And part of my reason for showing you this is so that you know what the role of an interpreter is, and when you're working with that interpreter, how you interact with that interpreter. And it also kind of clarifies your role as well. And so we always instruct the interpreter to review the interpreter's code of ethics as frequently as they can. Don't throw out that piece of paper. Don't put your Bridging the Gap textbook on the shelf. Take it out. Have it by your side. Engage with those issues and dialogue with us when problems come up. Something that we tell people is to remember that everything stated in the session is strictly confidential. They have to make that clear. And we have different ways of doing that. One is for people to start out with an introduction. We call it a pre-session, in which they introduce themselves in both languages. And what they're stating is that, one, please speak in, short sentences. I will raise my hand to stop you if you're speaking too fast. And please remember, everything you say will be interpreted exactly as you say it, and everything is strictly confidential. So that's all stated at the very, very beginning. And the reason is that if the interpreter needs to refer back to that, then they can say, remember, I did say everything you state will be interpreted exactly as you state it. And we can kind of go into some of the issues regarding that and some examples I have a little bit later on. An interpreter uses the first person when speaking. They would say, I have a headache when I get up in the morning, and not, she says she has a headache when she gets up in the morning. This use of the word I, first person, clarifies, the statement, and it cuts down on confusion. When you have too many pronouns there, it can get a little crazy. The interpreter, in-person interpreter, is told to sit next to and a little behind the client so that the provider looks at the client and not at the interpreter. And then we always say, of course, the interpreter needs to introduce himself or herself in both languages. Interpreting protocols here. We would say, stop the provider anytime you do not understand a word or a phrase. The interpreter is trained to stop and intervene, and it's a very structured statement. The interpreter uses third person in this sense, in saying the interpreter needs clarification about the word radiology, for example. And so in that way, the person listening knows that the interpreter is not stating what the client said or the patient said, but what the interpreter needs. And the same goes for when the interpreter needs to, ask a question of the client. Now, when you stop for clarification, you tell the provider and the patient what you are doing exactly. You wouldn't want the patient or the client wondering, why is she talking about me in English? What's going on here? And so the client or the patient needs to be, informed about what's going on. An interpreter is trained never to summarize. We don't summarize at all. However, there is one exception, and that's if there's a lot of background talk. Let's say that the session's being interrupted by somebody coming in and asking for a signature on a document that has nothing to do with the interpretation. That might be summarized, but the interaction between the client and the provider, that is never summarized. That's always units of thought are interpreted. If you're not qualified to interpret, we tell the interpreter, state that immediately. Do not pretend you know how to interpret. So this comes up when you have variations of the language. And it could be a little bit of a mix-up. For example, somebody needed a Karen interpreter, and instead they asked for a Burmese interpreter. And the interpreter arrives and starts to interpret, and the Karen speaker knows a little bit of Burmese, but not as deeply. And they kind of go along thinking they understand, and then they ask a question, which demonstrates that, of course, they don't understand. That interpreter needs to step back and say, I apologize, but I believe this person is speaking a different language. You know, I believe they're speaking Karen, and I am not qualified to interpret in that language. So the interpreter needs to be able to do that, and can't pretend to keep going, because the client may feel embarrassed. Oh, I really should remember Burmese, but I haven't spoken it since I was in my country, and we're speaking Karen at home all the time. They shouldn't be put in that position to have to pretend that they know what's going on. So before a home visit, the interpreter remains outside. I'm sorry, there's a typo there, until the staff person arrives. During a home visit, the interpreter is trained to wait until you arrive as the staff person, and then to go in. They don't go in ahead of time. They don't open the door and walk through the door and say hello to everybody, or, you know, however that is. They don't do that, because once that happens, once they're alone with the client will naturally, you know, tell them things that you should know as a staff person. And so we, no, we don't do that. And then, as I said earlier, if there is a site translation needed, the interpreter will request that you read the document, and then they will interpret the document. Okay, I wonder if there are questions. I hope I can hold them a little bit. Now, this is kind of a summary again of everything, and it's primarily an overview. Of course, the interpreter uses the appropriate introduction. They use direct speech, which is that using the word I. Just some extra things here too. Of course, they demonstrate a language proficiency. They avoid taking over the conversation. This is important, especially during phone calls, and we'll talk a little bit about what that's like as well. You know, sometimes it's harder to figure out when somebody has ended their conversation before you start up, and on the phone, an interpreter needs to be careful of that, to, you know, wait for the pause to take over. And of course, we've talked about impartiality. They use good intervention techniques. They change register. Register is a key concept. It means the level of language used. Of course, doctors use a very high register, many complicated words in terms. And if the interpreter needs to bring it down so that the client understands, they know how to do that. They don't want to condescend. And so they're aware of you know, what the client needs in terms of understanding, and they check in. They're trained to check in with the client to make sure that there's understanding. And they, of course, interpreter would demonstrate complete, accurate interpreting. Note-taking skills. This is something interpreters are trained to do. And they have their own unique shorthand that they may use. They have to rip those notes up once they're finished because it's confidential information. So we train them to do that. We talked about asking for clarification. Side conversations. This is really what we want to avoid. This can be the #1 problem. And of course, as I said earlier, it's very natural for a person to want to trust that speaker from their home country who speaks their language. And so they'll have a side conversation. The interpreter in that first introduction has made it clear that everything stated will be interpreted. And so all they need to do is remind them, oh, remember in the very beginning, I said, everything you say will be interpreted. And they can do that very gently and politely. Demonstrates proficiency interpreting words without equivalencies. This is also an issue too, that, English can be a very concise shorthand language, and other languages might take longer to define or describe or interpret. We have to be aware of that. You'll find that somebody is speaking a lot, and you may be a little worried that they're adding more in there that you didn't intend. Likely not, but you can always double check. You can always say, please, can you tell me exactly what you're interpreting? And, and you can always remind them, interpret everything I say, please, exactly as I say it, just to be sure. In any language encounter, we don't know what's going to happen. And interpreters are trained very well, but sometimes even they can't prepare for the unusual. An interpreting session, we always say, is not a natural conversation. It's not like what we're having right now. It's different. It's a unique style of communication, all on its own, and we each have to learn how to do it because it's not natural. Now, there will be cultural differences and cultural information. An interpreter is trained to be a cultural broker in which they understand their culture and they also understand the culture of their communities. And they can be very good resources in clarifying things that may not make sense. Also, on the other side, too, an interpreter will need to clarify very often our culture in mainstream United States Western culture as well. An interpreter manages the flow of the conversation in all of these ways that we've already stated, and they demonstrate good interpersonal skills. They're pleasant, they have a modulated voice, and they're respectful. Let's just keep going. One thing to remember, interpreting is unpredictable. As we said, it's not a natural conversation. An interpreter has to be aware of this possibility. They may be at the laundromat and, looking for a sock and the dryer eats them up, that kind of thing. So they have to be on their toes all the time. So in that note, I always have this word of caution about using Google Translate. Just recently, earlier in the month, a Pennsylvania court judge ruled that the Google Translate app has alarming capacity for miscommunication and error, and it does not make an adequate method for soliciting consent. Okay, it's not very useful for very, very specific things. And so we would really discourage using it, in any kind of in-depth conversation or interpreting session you need. It might be something to use just for basics. But then double check because it's not bad technology, but it's not perfect. And language is so intricate and complex that you do need perfect interpretation. Now, about video remote interpreting, which is often what we're using these days, especially due to COVID. We always give these instructions to the interpreter, and we also would share them with the client who's using it. We would say, or the customer really, the agency who's using it, we have to be realistic. Is it really going to work? It might not always be convenient. We would say, don't use earbuds, but use a headset. Don't rely on Wi-Fi. Use a computer and not the phone. And be sure that there is solid bandwidth and do a tech test first. And often when we're scheduling interpreters, the client or the customer really allows a little bit of time for that tech test at first, especially if there'll be more than 3 people, on the session. Let's say it's a large IEP meeting or something along those lines, or a community meeting, and many people are coming in, like today, what we're doing today. So those are some things to keep in mind. Otherwise, the practices and protocols are just about the same for telephone interpreting and video remote interpreting as they would be for in-person interpreting. Let's just take a look a little bit more deeply. So we would say for over the phone interpreting, make sure you have a great connection and that the phone's battery has power. We give this advice to interpreters, but we know that it applies to people who are using interpreters. Of course, a quiet space. And when you're going to use an interpreter, we always say, make sure you give the number to call. You know, don't give your office number if you're not going to be at the office, for example, but give your cell phone number if that's where you'll be, or don't give the client's number if you don't mean for the interpreter to call the client, that kind of thing. We always are specific about that. But this is important for anyone working with an interpreter. You have to give all the info that you want the interpreter to know about any kind of phone call they will be making to a client. If you have information about a confirmation, you want interpreter to come at a certain date and time, and you want the you want the client to, you know, to be available at a certain date and time, and you want the client also to have their Medicaid number with them so they can read it off on the phone, and you want them to have the birth dates of their children. Make sure all of that information is given to the interpreter exactly as you would want it stated. So there are different kinds of phone interpreting sessions. What I just described would probably be a confirmation call. Other ones in which you have more than one person on the call would be a conference call. And so there are many methods we're using. When we are working with in-person interpreting, positioning is really important because what an interpreter is doing is facilitating communication. They're really making sure that you, the staff person, are really in charge. And the staff person, you, and the client have the relationship, not the interpreter, client, staff person. It's not a three-way, it's a two-way. That interpreter is always behind the scenes. And so we make sure that the client and provider see each other and talk facing each other. Here's the wrong position. Everybody is talking to that interpreter. It's a mess right there. We don't want that to happen. This is a better situation where the patient and the provider are talking right here. They're the focus of the day, and the interpreter is behind the scenes. We hope this can happen sometimes, depending on, you know, configurations in rooms, but we know that the basic idea is to facilitate the partnership of these two people. That's the interpreter's job. Now, things to keep in mind when working with interpreters. Make sure that interpreter introduces himself or herself. Keep your questions and dialogue directed to the client. Do not ask the interpreter questions, and don't speak in jargon or slang, but in clear, direct sentences. And then remember too, interpreters are trained to interpret everything stated exactly as stated. So don't take them aside and ask them a personal question or a question about the client, for example. And then, as I said earlier, that summarization would take place if there's talking on the side. And remember, interpreters are trained not to be alone with the client. Behavioral and psychological surveys need staff presence to complete. A satisfaction survey, it's okay. You can give an interpreter a satisfaction survey to give to a client, but anything in depth, a medical history, any of these other surveys, they have to, you know, be done while you are there. As we said, you know, we would say read the document and the interpreter interprets. And then, as we said, languages often don't have equivalents. If an interpreter is taking a long time, it might be that that time is needed. But if you believe the interpreter might be speaking outside that message, you can intervene and you can remind the interpreter, and interpreters don't mind that you do that, really. Here is just an idea of your introduction. And this is what you will hear the interpreter say in English, and then you'll hear them say it in their own language too. And so you can just read that really on your own. As I said before, it's, really restating everything you say will be interpreted. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes, and this won't take long because I know you probably have questions, and we want to have a little time for discussion. What I'd like to do is analyze two separate interpreting sessions together. So we're going to start out. I'm going to read this to you, and I'm going to give you an example of the good session. So here we go. The print in black is the staff counselor, the blue is the interpreter, and the red is the client. We're going to assume that there's been an introduction already. So the staff counselor says, "How can we help you?" The interpreter, "How can we help you?" The client, "I don't know if I'm eligible for any programs." The interpreter, "I don't know if I'm eligible for any programs." Staff counselor, "Let me ask you a few questions." Interpreter, "Let me ask you a few questions." Client, "Okay, I'll try, but I may not have all the information." Interpreter, "Okay, I'll try, but I may not have all the information." Staff counselor, "We can start with an easy question. What is your date of birth?" Interpreter, "We could start with an easy question. What is your date of birth?" Client, "Oh, that one is easy. March 4th, 1994. Interpreter, "Oh, that one's easy. March 4th, 1994. Now it went clickety, clickety, click without any bumps. And, of course, human nature doesn't always go that way, but almost, just about. An interpreter states everything exactly as you say it, not omitting, changing, or adding anything. This is called conduit or verbatim interpreting. They're not having to stop and ask for clarification, and it's going smoothly. However, they certainly could do that if needed. But now I'm going to show you, for other purposes, where it kind of goes south and it doesn't end up very well. A bad session. Staff counselor, "How can we help you?" Interpreter, "How can we help you?" Client, "I don't know if I'm eligible for any programs." Interpreter, "I don't know if I'm eligible for any programs." Staff counselor, "Tell her I need to ask a few questions." Interpreter, "We have a few questions for you." Client, "Will you tell her I don't have much time?" Interpreter, stopping to talk to the client directly. "Come on, you have to give the information they need." Staff counselor, "Okay, first, ask her to give me the date of her birth." Interpreter, "Tell us the date of your birth." Client, "Oh, that one is easy. March 4th, 1994. Interpreter, "She was born on March 4th, 1994. Staff counselor, "Okay, now I need to get birth dates of all the kids." Interpreter, "List the birth dates of your children." Client, "You have them from the last time you interpreted for me, remember?" Okay, you see where this went bad. At the time in which the staff counselor switched over and said, "Tell her I need to ask a few questions," instead of speaking directly to that client, she spoke to the interpreter and gave the interpreter the direction to carry on, the detailed questions. And the interpreter went along with it. She didn't say, "Oh, please, you can speak directly to the client." Interpreters are trained to do that because, as I said, everything's unpredictable, right? And so she knows that she can guide that staff counselor if they forget that they should be speaking directly to the client. But she didn't do it. She goes, "We have a few questions for you." She uses that "we." And then the client says, "Will you tell her I don't have much time?" Still not talking directly to the client. And then the interpreter, the client says, "Will you tell her I don't have much time?" So she's kind of getting into it too. Now you tell, that staff counselor that I don't have much time. And then the interpreter will then talk to the client. "Come on, you have to give the information they need. Come on, come on." So she's interfering right there. And she's acting like a counselor instead of an interpreter. And the staff counselor says, "Okay, first ask her to give me the date of her birth." Again, it goes on and on and on. So this ends up as a real problem because at the very end, the client says, "Hey, you got it all. You know what's going on." And that's not true. An interpreter is not supposed to, of course, retain information about a client, and they're not supposed to know much that's going on. In fact, most interpreters forget once they walk out the door, they forget what they just interpreted. Of course, their minds work in the moment, and it's a little bit much, for them to expect them to remember that kind of thing. Just to give you an example of what not to do. All right, and we've analyzed it very well, I think. I want to give you some recommended resources. The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down is a marvelous. It is the book on interpreting. It's a story of a Hmong child who was born in Fresno with epilepsy. And her treatment was not understood by her parents because they were not provided with a good interpreter from the beginning. And so the child's treatment, when sometimes was successful, most of the time was not successful. For a while, the parents lost the child to foster care, and they eventually were able to get their child back. The child did suffer a grand mal seizure, and the parents took care of that girl, their daughter, for about 30 years until she died at home. They cared for her tenderly and with such love. But from the very beginning, they, felt ostracized and bewildered and very, very distressed about what was going on with the care of their daughter. So it really is an incredible lesson in the primacy of good interpreting. The Migration Policy Institute, in which I got some of the figures previously, is an incredible resource. It will give you migration information on the US and the world, immigration policy, language access, and education as well. It's probably the source to go to. There are many out there that may not be accurate. In fact, even have a political agenda, but this is an excellent, excellent institute to rely on for resources. So I'm going to make sure that you have this PowerPoint available. And I think right now I'm going to stop sharing and look at your questions and responses, and we will continue talking for a bit. Hello there, everybody. So I think we do have some questions, don't we? I think I can look at those questions, I believe. Yes. Okay, this is a good one. What is the difference between a trained interpreter and a certified interpreter? A certified interpreter, we have the healthcare certification for healthcare interpreters, and that is an interpreter who has been trained 40 hours of healthcare interpreting. And they've taken 2 tests. One test would be in the protocols of interpreting, and another test would be a performance test in their language. And at this point, there are 3 languages for that performance test. There's Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and Arabic. It's enormously complex and expensive to create a language test in a language. It can cost up to $100,000 to create one test in a language. So we only have 3 at this point, but there are more in the making. So what a person does is they acquire the 40 hours that they need of healthcare interpreter training, and then they apply and they take the test, the first test. If they are not an interpreter in Spanish, Arabic, or Mandarin Chinese, they would have what we would call the core CHI, Certification Healthcare Commission interpreter. And everybody knows that there are only 3 languages that have that performance test. However, if they do speak a language that a test can accommodate, they would go forward and take that second test to be certified. So that is the procedure right now. So a trained interpreter has had 40 hours of training. This is I'm thinking of our Bridging the Gap training. I would say would have 40 hours of healthcare interpreter training. There are other training programs that I don't know how what the schedules are right now within the city, but MCC sometimes offers the interpreter training courses. And so does Children's Mercy for Spanish bilingual interpreters, and Johnson County for Spanish interpreters as well. JVS has the Bridging the Gap, which is open to any language. I hope that answers that question. And then I'm going to take a look at the other one. For organizations, medical, community, academic, in need of one-time interpreters, what local companies or organizations can they reach out to hire trained interpreters? Well, there are, I mean, for organizations, we have, JVS is the nonprofit interpreter services organization. There may be one other, I don't know how broad it is, but there are agencies within the city, and they're pretty prominent. You can just Google interpreter agencies in Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City, Kansas, or in the whole metro area, and they'll pop right up. Who is legally liable in case of poor interpreting? The interpreter, the interpreter agency, or the clinic facility? That's a really good question. Interpreters have to have errors and omission liability coverage, and any agency, including ours, that employs interpreters has that coverage. It can be group coverage, and if an interpreter is fully independent and doesn't sign on with an agency, they have to buy that errors and omission liability coverage themselves. So we always make sure that interpreters are covered. All right, any other questions? How useful are apps? Like, I haven't heard of this app, but I would say that apps, be careful with apps, just as Google Translate, which is supposed to be, the best one. The judge ruled earlier in the month. I think it might be better to use it just, for introductions and hellos, but not for deep answers to things. Okay.
Well, Catherine, it looks like we're right at 9:30, and we got through all of the questions. You did an excellent job of answering all of the questions that we had this morning, and I'm sure there's many more questions, but definitely appreciate all of your information that you shared. It's very helpful to see some of those pointers and what an interpreting session should look like. So definitely appreciate everything that you have shared with us this morning. We will make this recording available to those that may want to watch it again. We also will get the PowerPoint from Catherine, but we want to give you a virtual round of applause. Catherine, thank you so much for all of your time and efforts, and just the many years that you have spent creating and helping interpreters really get more of the support that they need. And thanks to all the work that JVS does in our community. We see several comments in the chat, excellent information, and lots of thank yous. So with that, we will end our time this morning, but we look forward to having you back maybe another time, Catherine, if that's okay, to share additional information with us. All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and please don't forget that we will send out a post survey just to get feedback from everyone who attended, and we'll look forward to hearing that feedback so that we as CCIR can make improvements and also get the information that you would like to hear more about to you all. So thank you for everyone's time this morning. Have an excellent Thursday. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.